In Oakville, and perhaps in Mississauga, dying trees on city property are marked with an orange X when they are slated for felling. As a friend pointed out to me, we all actually have X's on our backs. They may be invisible, but they're there nonetheless. We just don't have a date for felling. But for me, for the last almost 4 years, I've had an X on my back. The difference is, we thought we knew the date. First it was 8 months, then 2 years, and finally another 11 months. As a result, most of my preaching has focused on combining what I saw in the scripture that spoke to the transitional time we have been in, and in addition spoke to our personal faith journeys through this time of a very global transition, and as well a transitional period in our church. As I come to my last 6 weeks as lead minister of Christ First, I am like a parent who is sending a child off into the world, a bit anxious that I haven't prepared you well enough for the next steps. But I have tried. Al Hubbard has faithfully archived all our Sunday services, and in addition, separately, my sermons on our website. It wouldn't hurt you to be reading those sermons over with your mind focused on the next part of your journey as Christ First, because after all, in a sense, almost all of my sermons assumed I was in the latter part of a ministry. As I consider my last words of advice to you, I look back over 47 years of ministry and teaching. I guess this happens to most of us in life. For a long time, I was the youngest in the room. A full candidate at the age of 16, I had a very long time to be the youngest in the room. Slowly, my colleagues seemed similar in age, and then that fateful day when I started working with a millennial colleague. It was a bit of a learning curve, and I must admit I did suggest at one point that we go for marriage counseling, which we did successfully. Eventually, it became a joy to work with her and other people much younger than myself. But one difference that I noticed between my generation and millennials are boundaries around work-life issues. With my first millennial colleague, I used to describe our sense of boundaries in this way. Hers were like iron, mine were like maple syrup. That has come full circle, and especially since the pandemic, our staff team, all younger than myself by decades, has welcomed the pushing of work boundaries into personal life. But our practice of sacrificing the personal for dedication to our ministries has to have a limit. So the question I ask and encourage you to ask is, how can I increase my ability to love without losing my life? A council chair years ago once presented me with a book I should have read monthly, I must admit. It was entitled Clergy Self-Care. As he gave it to me, he said that he should have found another book first, and the title of this book would be How to Find Time to Read Clergy Self-Care. According to the book Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend, boundaries define us, define who we are. Even with maple syrup boundaries, I found myself teaching courses on personal and ethical boundaries to theological students and interns. And though I haven't lived it very successfully, I want to stress this for you in your personal life and in this transition to a new minister. When it comes to boundaries, different is not wrong. Just because people have different boundaries does not mean that they are less caring. Human boundaries are precious, God-given, and need to be respected. When we make sacrifices as Christians, we may have trouble distinguishing the difference between making a sacrifice to live out our Christian values and giving our very selves away. And so I turn to Jesus and his unique encounter with a bleeding woman. The first thing to say is that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is often trying to get away from crowds in order to pray by himself. It happens enough to say that It's a theme in the Gospel of Mark. The second thing to say is that Jesus had been doing a lot of healing before this encounter. Immediately before, he had healed Jairus' daughter. Before that, he had sent unclean spirits from a very troubled man into a herd of pigs. The swineherd reported his loss of the pigs, and people were urging Jesus to get out of town for his own safety. So now he is on the move, stopping once to heal, and then, surrounded by a crowd pressing in on him, he feels power leaving his body. Imagine that feeling. Perhaps a sense of fainting, a lightheadedness, a stumble, a sense of not being in control, crushed by others. And the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, which physicians had not been able to cure. In fact, she had endured much under many physicians. She too would have been lightheaded, faint, out of control, crushed by the crowds. In addition, she would have been poor from doctors' fees and feeling worse from their treatments. The first action in the encounter is hers. She sacrifices everything to be there. The threat of the crowd, the remote chance that her action will be successful. And yet, she persists. She breaks through her boundaries and Jesus' boundaries, and in doing so, she gains her life. But the effect is so intense that it is tangible to Jesus. He feels his boundary being broken as power leaves him and enters the woman. Jesus' boundary has been broken. We know this with his first response. Who touched me? Whose hand came into contact with my clothes? And yet, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So how does this encounter challenge or support my argument that boundaries are God-given and precious when boundaries are being cracked open all over the place in this story? First, boundaries are meant to be permeable. If we are to be in community, in communion with one another, we are always moving in and out of people's boundaries. As you get more into in-person worship, nothing will change from the recorded services of the pandemic if you don't talk to one another, ask personal questions to elicit stories, share your life with one another. Continue the process of amalgamation by deepening the relationships between yourself and those who come from a different founding church or who cross the threshold from another place. Telling your life stories isn't giving yourself away. When the woman touched the hem of Jesus' cloak, he knew that life was flowing from him. That is what it is to be fully, truly human. In the best possible world, all that is within us is life, love, goodness, and that is to be shared. Jesus comes to us in human form, showing us how to respond to the needs of others, connecting with others. And yet he preserves himself for another day. The witness of the gospel writer is that Jesus does go away to pray on his own a lot. That's how he preserves his very self. And in this unexpected brush with her, he is able to celebrate the faith of the woman who is now whole. As you get to know our new minister, accept and protect her boundaries as wonderfully as you have accepted my lack of them. Recognize your own boundaries without separating yourself from others, so that you deepen your relationships. Share what is good in you, perhaps not what are your failings, but to share what is good, life, love within you in deepened relationship. And stay tuned for more as we walk these last weeks together.